The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of vast expansion for the British Empire. In 1860, the British Empire measured 2.5 million square miles. In 1899, it measured 9.3 million. In 1870, only 10% of Africa was claimed by European powers. By 1913, Britain alone claimed 25%, with 90% of the continent being governed from Europe. This period is known as New Imperialism, because the sudden expansion of claims by European powers was entirely unprecedented. In fact, the word imperialism was co-opted specifically to refer to it. It was perceived as a new word in the mid-19th century, and by 1900 it had exploded into public usage. Hobson, writing in 1903, states that it is a word that was on everybody's lips and used to denote the most powerful movement in the current politics of the Western world. Empires were growing, not only literally, but also mentally. Britons and other Europeans were becoming more aware of their empires, more proud and more vocal. But what were the reasons for new imperialism? Why did the British and other empires grow so much in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? What did they have to gain? This video will go over the various justifications for the British Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We'll first discuss the racial and cultural element. Was it a desire on the part of the British to civilise the world? Did they believe that they could lead their colonies towards a brighter future? Then, we'll look at imperial strategy. What potential advantages did Britain hope to gain from expanding their empire? Then, we'll look at an aspect of what made new imperialism so unique: the politics, or posturing. Why countries, but specifically Britain, took more notice of their empires and used them as an opportunity to flex their ability. I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world that we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Added to this, the absorption of the greater portion of the world under our rule simply means the end of all wars. I should work towards the furtherance of the British Empire, for the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule, for the recovery of the United States, for the Anglo-Saxon race but one empire. What a dream, but yet it is still probable. It is possible. These are the words of Cecil Rhodes, written in around 1877. The British, he believed, were the most civilized race on Earth, with a unique ability to govern. Through imperial expansion, this gift could be magnanimously shared with the rest of the world. This sounds rightly insane to us today, but Rhodes was an ardent imperialist, at a time when imperialist was not a dirty word. We have no reason to doubt that Rhodes sincerely believed that the Anglo-Saxon race were in every way superior to all other races and peoples. But Rhodes believed that this superior status was entrenched and unchanging, that the Anglo-Saxon race was the best at governing, and so they should govern the world around. This isn't the only perception though. Henry Morris, writing in 1901, believed that, though Britain controlled its territories in a variety of ways, only one fixed rule of action seems to exist. It is to promote the interests of the colony to the utmost, to develop its scheme of government as rapidly as possible, and eventually to elevate it from the position of inferiority to that of association. Morris believed that Britain could and would teach its colonies to govern, and that Britain would bring them up to the level of equality. Whatever racial qualities the Anglo-Saxon race had could be shared with others. When we look here, we're seeing two separate but similar arguments. Rhodes approached imperialism from the perspective of race. It was, to him, an unchanging fact of life that Britons were the best at governing. But Morris approached instead from the perspective of culture. Attitudes to government could change, and the mission of the British Empire was to hasten that change. These two beliefs aren't mutually exclusive. It's easy to find accounts which swap between the concepts led by racial characteristics, which couldn't be changed, to arguments led by cultural traits, which could. In popular culture, for example, the concepts of race and culture are inseparable. Punch magazine, in 1892, citing the intention of Rhodes to build a telegraph from Cairo to Cape Town, drew this famous picture of the Rhodes Colossus accompanied by a song. O'er Africa's striding from dark end to forward black emancipation. Africa was dark. Black people were perceived as uncivilized, which Punch equates with being enslaved. But the introduction of communication technology was able to free them, and presumably to illuminate Africa. In an advertisement for Pears soap in the 1890s, after the recent British acquisition of Sudan, it read, "Even if our invasion of the Sudan has done nothing else, it has at any rate left the Arab something to puzzle his fuzzy head over, for the legend, 'Pears soap is the best,' inscribed in huge white characters on the rock which marks the furthest point of our advance towards Berber, will tax the wits of the dervishes of the desert to translate." The Arab is described with racial stereotypes, and their relationship with white people is seen as diminutive. But Western knowledge, even if in this context as a joke, is seen as enlightening in the deepest recesses of Africa. These are both satirical accounts, but they expose an amorphous understanding of race which is linked closely with cultural differences, such that they can be synonymous. This is partially because, as satirical accounts, they don't investigate the concept closely, and also because the concept of race itself, and responses to it, are culturally imagined anyway, so of course it varies in different places, and at different times, and to different people, without any concrete definition being supplied. But it doesn't have to be concrete and defined for it to be believed. I'm sure the comments on this video are cast iron evidence for that. Beliefs in Britain's cultural or racial superiority were used in politics and in public discourse to explain the position of Britain as the preeminent world power, and also to justify further expansions throughout its history. If the British were colonising to civilise, then by colonising, they could believe that they were doing the world a favour. But there isn't very much evidence that this was official imperial policy. This, of course, doesn't mean it wasn't influential. Themes of race and culture constantly recur when looking at other factors. While they may not be a primary factor, they hold great influence on the justification for the period of new imperialism. After all, how else can you justify colonising a quarter of a continent if you didn't, on some level, believe that its current inhabitants were beneath you? The imperial policy of Great Britain after 1870, and more particularly after 1885, was almost entirely absorbed in promoting the subjugation and annexation of tracts of territory where no genuine white settlement of any magnitude was contemplated. From the standpoint of government, it implies a progressive diminution of freedom in the British Empire by constantly increasing the proportion of its subjects who are destitute of the real power of self-government. Hobson, writing in 1903, observes that the period of new imperialism had hugely reduced the proportion of the population under British rule that had self-government, and as such, the assertion that Morris made, that the British Empire was to educate its dependencies in government, was quite the largest misstatement of the facts of our colonial and imperial policy that is possible. Statistically, only 1 in 34 British subjects in 1903 had self-government. Outside of Canada, Australia and New Zealand, no colony could be considered self-governing. Making up 11 million people, this left over 300 million with nothing resembling democracy. Whatever else the British Empire aimed to be, it was not a spreader of democracy or self-government, and it was not the shining beacon of methods for fair government. Instead, Britain's imperial policy can best be understood strategically. Territories with self-government were also the territories which could be trusted. Their strategic interests never differed greatly from those of Britain's. But when looking elsewhere at other colonies, this is not the case. Colonies like Jamaica or Malta did host elections, but the true power lay with a governor, appointed by Britain, who then appointed his own council. The strategic interests of Jamaica or Malta differed from Britain's. They might foster their own domestic development differently, if given the reins of self-government. While their opinions were considered, they weren't paramount. Then, in areas like Egypt or India, their interests differed drastically to those of Britain. Governments in these places would definitely benefit from domestic policy, and this was rarely promoted over Britain's own interests. There is a racial and cultural correlation here. Canada, Australia and New Zealand, the only colonies with self-government, were, it must be said, predominantly white settled. From a racial perspective, they were Anglo-Saxon. From a cultural perspective, they both shared and expected the values of self-government. Colonies which were not predominantly white settled, though, were only entrusted with government as far as racial lines, the most damning example being the Cape Colony of South Africa. Ultimately, the extent to which these places were self-governed depends on the strategic and economic interests that they shared. It was in the economic interests of Australia to not industrialise under British rule. Australian farmers made a fortune by providing sheep and their wool to Britain for processing. In the Cape Colony, the minority white rule were also the rich colonisers who stood to gain from British imperialism. Proper majority rule would mean that, very swiftly, the population in the Cape Colony would vote against the interests of this minority. And in India, the lack of industrialisation can only be interpreted as in Britain's economic interests. India provided a large population to buy British goods. If India produced its own goods, then Britain would face more competition, and India would be competing with Britain in the same places. Consequently, in industrial towns in Lancashire, where textiles were processed, labour unions of workers and the owners of factories were in agreement that India must remain deindustrialised. Indian industrialisation would affect the profits, prices and wages of both groups. Indians would be buying Indian goods and would not be buying British goods. In the late 19th century, British industrialists were increasingly anxious of this possibility. The fear of fiercer market competition driving down profits was not without basis and, ever increasingly, was not without precedent. In the early 19th century, Britain held vast market share on the production of goods. As the first industrialised nation, it could provide cheap fabrics and metals to the world at prices with which they could not compete. For industrialists, this meant a British monopoly on the production of goods. They controlled the market. But from the 1850s onwards, Britain's lead was reducing in scale. Other nations, but specifically Germany and the United States, were catching up, producing their own goods and eating into Britain's titanic market share. This had two effects. Prices began to fall. In the second half of the 19th century, with more things being made, there was more competition, so the average price of goods kept falling to accommodate. The obvious answer to this problem is to increase production to maintain profits at their expected levels. But the numbers of customers was not growing at a fast enough rate to buy the increase in production. This meant that prices only fell further because of overproduction. In Britain, between 1873 and 1896, prices fell, on average, by 40%. The price of iron fell by 50%. 8%, and the price of wheat fell by 66% in this period. The second effect was a response to the first. Other industrial nations were no longer dependent upon British production, because they could make their own things. So they introduced taxation on foreign goods, aiming to increase the retail price of British goods and make them less competitive than their own. Italy, France, Germany, and the United States were all industrializing, and all introduced these taxes to protect their own interests. But Britain didn't introduce these taxes, partially because they didn't need to protect their own industry, and partially because they were dependent upon foreign agriculture to feed themselves. Britain imported 56% of all cereals, 76% of cheese, and 68% of eggs. The theory had been that the world fed Britain, and Britain clothed the world. If industrialists were producing too many goods to sell, then the obvious answer was to find more people to sell things to. This is why the British Empire increased in size by a factor of 4 between 1860 and 1900. The people on this land were, in theory, customers. But for all of the ideas in favour of imperial expansion, the most convincing is probably the most simple. European powers wanted African territory because it was a thing that great powers did. Great powers were in competition with each other to claim the world, and began to feel more pride in holding more land, irrespective of whether anybody even lived there. Hobsbawm has said that once the status of a great power thus became associated with raising its flag over some palm-fringed beach, or more likely over stretches of dry scrub, the acquisition of colonies itself became a status symbol, irrespective of their value. For a country to establish itself as a great power, it now had to demonstrate that it could both acquire and maintain colonies. This had become the benchmark. Britain obviously already owned strategic colonies around the world. In the face of a decline, it added to these possessions with land that it didn't make much sense to control. France expanded hugely. Even the United States began to expand, taking colonies from Spain in 1898. Germany expanded after its unification, though really Germany wished for European expansion. They obtained territory in Africa because it proved their standing on the European stage. Italy sought to do the same, attempting to take Ethiopia. There was an attempt to counter this relentless competition. The Berlin Conference fixed a standard for the amicable division of the continent. It was mainly devoted to laying out the terms on which trade was allowed to flow freely within Africa. But the part which is most important reads, "Any power which henceforth takes possession of a tract of land on the coasts of the African continent, outside of its present possessions, shall accompany the respective act with a notification thereof, addressed to the other signatory powers of the present act." This made the claiming of new territory an affair on which all other powers were notified. The formalisation of the process meant that powers like Britain felt a sudden impetus to claim land before anybody else could. Because politics was operating in tandem with strategic, economic, cultural and racial reasons for imperial expansion, it becomes difficult to work out whether a country wanted to expand because it would in some way be useful, or simply because it wanted to gesture itself. If Britain could claim the most land in this new competitive game, then her standing as the world's preeminent power was unaltered. The grand achievement of painting a large portion of the world map a singular colour, cartographers red, is a legacy which the British Empire still holds today. But the explosive growth of the British Empire in this period is emblematic only of imperial decline. It is tempting to boil the reason for the imperial expansion down to a purely singular reason, and these are interpretations that you will find time and again. But it's important to bear in mind all of these factors coalesced in order to understand the British Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.